Hello everybody, welcome back to our series of videos on economic growth. In the last video we looked at how we measure economic growth when GDP data is not readily available and what's required to have any economic growth at all, some of those foundational economic institutions like private property rights and the rule of law. So once you have those institutions in place, we still see that some countries grow faster than others. And so in this video, we're going to explore that phenomenon, and ultimately it comes down to productivity. And so to talk about productivity, we're going to start with the production function, which is the process of turning economic inputs like labor and capital into output. The process of turning economic inputs like labor and capital into output. And capital here, labor we're talking about workers, capital we're talking about machines and buildings and factories and tools, basically things that help us become more productive. Okay, and so labor and capital are inputs. When we add more workers, we get more output. When we add more machines, we get more output. And if we're talking about total GDP, the total level of GDP in a country, as we saw in our previous video on GDP, we saw that places like China have really high total GDPs. China has the second largest economy in the world. But one of the things we talked about there was the countries that have a lot of people generally also have really high GDPs. And so here we're talking just about total GDP, and then we'll talk again about GDP per capita. But what contributes to larger total GDPs? Here we're thinking about labor, just the number of people in a place. Human capital, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail in later in the video. Human capital, but basically these are skills, education, expertise, anything that makes labor more productive. So basically, if you have more people, you're going to have a higher GDP. If the people are more educated or more skilled, they're going to be higher GDP. We also have physical capital. Here we're talking about tools, machines, structures, and so on and so forth. And finally, technology, which can make both labor or capital more productive. Makes labor or capital more productive. So if you have more technology, higher total GDP. More machines, higher total GDP. But again, when we're concerned about economic growth, we're not concerned about total GDP as much as we are GDP per capita. And so the GDP per capita production is just a function of all of those things, but again, per capita. So I'm going to skip labor for a second, but human capital per capita. So the education per person in a country will affect the GDP per person in a country, or the economic growth. So human capital per capita, physical capital per capita, and technology per capita. So, as you add more technology per person, capital per person, and and human capital per person, we're going to see economic growth. I left out labor per capita in that primary list because at first glance this may seem redundant because it's like people per people. But the labor here is the workforce, and per capita is the entire population. Population. And in fact, let me put entire population. So not everybody in the population works, and so we can actually see increases in GDP per capita with an increase in the workforce per person, per population. And a couple important areas where this has happened in the United States. One is the female labor force participation rate. Female labor force, I'll just put it over here, participation. And so especially since the 1960s, there's been a dramatic increase in the female labor force participation rate, so labor per capita has increased. It's also possible to go the opposite direction, and this is a concern in a lot of, especially Western nations, the age composition. And so if you have if you have an aging population, a workforce that's getting older and retiring, and not being replaced by younger and new workers through demographic trends or through immigration, a decreasing labor per capita, as we see older and fewer workers as they retire, a decreasing labor per capita could actually decrease economic growth, which is something a lot of developed countries, Western countries in particular, are being faced with at the moment. So labor per capita is also there. And ultimately, these are again coming back into the production function, and this tidbit here, an economy's growth rate of GDP per capita is closely linked to its rate of productivity growth. So this looks like the original image that we showed in this series of videos, but this is not real GDP per capita. This is real output per hour of all persons. So essentially, what we're talking about here is labor productivity. And if you recall, just as we saw from the mid-80s, 1984 to 2020, this doesn't go quite to 2020, but from the mid-80s, we're sitting here at about mid-50s, let's call it about 50, it's just the index. And by 2018, we're at a little bit over 100, let's call it 105. And this is, I mean, really 50, 51, 50, 55 even, but just like we saw for real GDP per capita, we've seen a growth rate of about 2% per year, meaning that it doubles every 36 years. So here to the early 80s is about 36 years. And just as we saw real GDP per capita doubling in about 36 years, we see labor productivity also doubling in that time frame. And so that growth in real GDP per capita is very highly correlated with the productivity in our nation and others. So the takeaway here, the U.S. worker produced over twice as much per hour in the 2010s than they did in the early 70s. The U.S. worker produced over twice as much per hour in the 2010s than they did in the early 70s. in the early 70s, which is exactly what we wrote when we saw the real GDP per capita graph, except we said the real GDP per capita is over twice as much in 2018 than the early 70s. And so, again, a very high correlation to real GDP per capita, and that's why we see this phenomenon that sustained long-term economic growth comes in the form of increased productivity. And here we're going to talk specifically about labor productivity, the value of what is produced per worker or per hour. The value of what is produced per worker or per hour. And so what contributes to labor productivity? A lot of these things that we had just talked about. So human capital in particular, which can come through education or experience. And generally, we think about human capital as the accumulated knowledge, skills, and expertise that the average worker in an economy possesses. The accumulated knowledge, skills, and expertise that the average worker in an economy possesses. That the average worker in an economy possesses. So again, education, whether it's through increased levels of high school achievement, college achievement, but even on-the-job training and vocational education is increasing the skills of the workforce. Also experience, as you do something, you get better at it. And so all of this contributes to our human capital. As this develops within an entire country, we call this capital deepening, a concept we'll talk about in just a minute. But this increase in human capital as a percentage of the entire population is really going to advance the economic progress of that country. Next one is technological change. Here, I want to mention two things: invention and innovation. Invention being advances in knowledge. Advances in knowledge. And innovation is putting inventions to use in a new product or service. Putting inventions to use in a new product or service. Okay, and so basically we can think of inventions as a number of possibilities. Examples for inventions could be something like the railroad, or the internal combustion engine, which allowed us to start creating cars. Internal combustion engine, or the computer or the internet. And something like innovation could be something like the U.S. highway system, right? We already had roads. We used roads, but the innovation of putting them to use to connect the entire country through a broad highway system, that's putting the use of roads to use in this new innovation, which allowed us to transport goods all across the country at much lower costs. Okay, next we have economies of scale. These are the cost advantages that industries obtain due to size. The cost advantages that industries obtain due to size. And when that happens, because again we're tying this all back to labor productivity, you can do more with fewer numbers of workers. If you have, say, one giant factory producing textiles or clothing, one very giant factory that has extremely large machinery and very efficient machinery is going to be able to produce the same amount of output with fewer workers than a bunch of much smaller factories with each individual worker maybe cutting and sewing things by hand instead of with machines. So as companies grow, they're able to do the same amount of work with fewer workers, and that's adding to labor productivity adding to economic growth. And then finally, this concept of capital deepening that I've mentioned is an increase in the level of capital per person. An increase in the level of capital per person. And this could be physical capital or human capital. So we're going to round out this video by looking at a couple examples of capital deepening in the United States. Here, looking at human capital deepening, the increase of high school and college achievement. If we go back to, say, 1970, only half of the people in the United States completed a high school degree, whereas now, if we would actually continue this out a little bit further, now it's greater than 90%. So we went from half without achieving high school to less than 10% having a high school degree. And with college, we went from less than 10% to, again, carry this out, almost 1/3 or 33% of the United States population achieving a college degree today. So, large increase in capital deepening through human capital, increasing the skills, knowledge, and education of the population. So this also has coincided with this increase in economic growth over the years. And then finally, physical capital, capital deepening of physical capital in the economy. I want to provide one specific example of this with the agricultural sector. So the graph to the left is a kind of generic productivity, capital deepening, but a very specific example within agriculture. Take in 1945, we have employment on farms. $10 million. And this data is coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, by the way. Agriculation. I don't know what I started saying there, but this should say agriculture. So 10 million people employed on farms, and farm output in 1945 was $23 billion dollars, the contribution to GDP. And in the year 2018, employment on farms was 875,000. So less than 1 million, which is a greater than a 10 times decrease in the number of farm jobs in the country. And output, if you want to guess, is that going to go up or down since 1945 with fewer workers? it has gone up. It's gone up significantly to $390 billion for a larger than 17 times increase. So with more than 10 times fewer workers, we have a 17 times increased output in in the agricultural sector. So doing more with less is by definition productivity, and that's because we have seen this capital deepening in the agricultural sector, where we have much more physical capital per person. One worker can do the same amount of work per hour because we have much larger machinery, much larger tractors, better seeds, better technology. All across the board, agriculture has become much more productive over time. Same thing could be said for manufacturing, and through that, we're increasing what can be created per worker or per hour, and that's this idea of capital deepening. So we see it in human capital, we see it in physical capital, in all sorts of industries across the United States. So physical capital deepening, the last part of labor productivity, and ultimately that labor productivity being tied back to economic growth in a country. So these are the big four components there: human capital, technological change, economies of scale, and capital deepening. When countries have higher levels of these per person, we'll expect to see higher growth rates in real GDP per person as well. So that'll do it for looking at why some countries grow faster and slower than others. We're going to continue with this idea in the next section, looking at this concept called economic convergence, where yes, some countries grow faster than others, but in general, low and middle income countries grow faster, 5 and 6%, than high income countries, which are growing at about 2%. So in the next video, we're going to look at convergence. Why do the lower income countries grow faster than the higher income countries? So stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys there. Thanks.